I am currently in the process of preparing our deep dive videos for the House of David Season 1, and while I'm still doing the research for those videos, I thought maybe we could have a little bit of fun. Throughout my review videos on this channel for each of the episodes of the season, every now and then I've mentioned the fact that over the course of the last several years, I've toyed with the idea of doing my own version of the David story, not in the form of a TV show, but in the form of a book. And throughout my videos, every now and then I've brought up different ways wherein the way that they did things on the show was either similar or different from my own version of the story. And so what I thought we could do over the course of the next several videos is I would basically just give you my pitch for how the House of David Season 1 could have gone. Let me just clarify right off the bat, in no way is this meant to be a critique of the show itself, and I'm not in any way suggesting that my version of the story is better. It's simply my take of the story. You could view this as an alternate reality version of the House of David Season 1. The honest truth about this whole thing is that I don't really see a reality wherein I finally actually sit down and write this book in its entirety and share it with the world. I just keep myself so busy with other stuff that even though I've always wanted to write books, I don't know if that's ever going to actually happen. And so this is kind of just a way for me to use YouTube as a creative outlet where I get my ideas out there and I get some feedback and see what y'all think about them. And so basically what we're going to do is I'm going to pull out an outline that I've typed up of my version of the story, and we're just going to walk through it. And along the way, you'll see some of the similarities and differences between my version of the story and the version that we see in the House of David show. And keep in mind, at the time that I'm recording this, only 5 episodes of the show have been released. You won't be seeing this until the whole first season is aired, and so there's actually probably some other similarities and differences that I don't even know about yet at the time of recording. So that's kind of exciting. My name's David Tate. This is Now Let's Be Honest. Let's get to it. All right, so as you can see here, I basically created a PowerPoint, and I've kind of just thrown my outline into the PowerPoint, and we're just going to kind of walk our way through it, and we're going to see some of the similarities and differences. We're not going to go through the entire plot today because I've actually fleshed this out quite a bit, but we're simply going to go through the first third of the plot, and you'll see some of the similarities and differences already. And throughout the PowerPoint, I've actually kind of taken little pictures from the show where they kind of correlate to my story, and I've kind of thrown them in there just to have a fun little visual aid. But I actually don't want to start with my story itself. I actually want to start with, in many ways, what kind of serves as the inspiration for my version of the David story. If you know anything about me, you will know that I am a very, very, very big Harry Potter fan. I love Harry Potter. I have read them since I was really young, and I've revisited that series several times. And in many ways, to me, the very first Harry Potter book, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, is one of the best introductions to a book series of all time, right? It kind of takes you into this alternate world and just helps you understand it, and it fills you with a sense of wonder and awe where it just drags you in and makes you want to understand the rest of the story. And if you just actually look at a chapter by chapter breakdown of that story, I think it's a brilliant introduction that helps people step from one world into the next. And one big goal that I had with my story is I'm not committing to 100% historical authenticity when it comes to the story of the Bible, because in many ways, similar to the House of David, what I wanted to do is I wanted to make the world that David lived in a little bit more fantastical and larger than life than our own. And one reason that I wanted to do that is because I wanted the readers of my book to recognize that the ancient world of the Bible is a very different world than our own. And so I kind of wanted it to feel like a fantasy world, very similar to, Harry Potter going off to Hogwarts and basically leaving our world into a totally different place. And so in many ways, I kind of actually took inspiration from Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone and how I even structured the book. And you can literally see that down to the very chapters themselves. And I'll be highlighting this as we go through. I might forget every now and then, but I wanted to just address this right off the bat so that you could see it and you can just kind of pick up on some of it if you're more familiar with the story. But I literally broke down my first book in this series into 17 chapters. And that's because there are 17 chapters in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. And I think, basically what I realized is that the story of David it actually is just a classic hero's journey story, right? The key difference is that I believe that the story of David is a historical reality that actually took place 3,000 years ago, right? But if you know Joseph Campbell and his hero's journey and stuff like that, you know that there is a general structure to storytelling that actually makes for a really compelling read. And Harry Potter is a great example of that. Star Wars is a great example of that. And I realized that the story of David in the Bible is also a great example of that, right? This is what C.S. Lewis would say whenever he talks about Christianity being the true myth, right? There's a lot of really compelling stories in the Bible, that actually follow the same structure of the fictional stories that we tell outside of the Bible. And I realized that David is a great example of the hero's journey. And in many ways, the plot progression of his story is very similar to things that we read about in Harry Potter, or that we see with Luke Skywalker in Star Wars. And so what I did with my version of this David story is I actually structured it directly based off of Harry Potter. I'm not just plagiarizing here, because I'm taking inspiration from all sorts of different things. And honestly, if you were just reading through the story, I don't think you would pick up on these connections, right? But that's basically what I did, right? And I even created little allusions in some of the chapter titles and everything like that. And I didn't follow it perfectly, right? Because like my story, like we're going to talk about in a second, it begins with an introduction, and I also have the book split into 3 parts. Harry Potter does not have any of that stuff. And that's because, as we're going to also talk about in a second, my book will not read like a child's book. My book would be much more mature, and it would be intended for, like a younger person could read it, but it's probably more intended for, probably people between the age of like 18 and 35 or something like that. And ideally even people older than that and stuff. And so I kind of visualized it being very different, but I did take inspiration from this, right? And so where chapter 1 of Harry Potter is called The Boy Who Lived, well, mine is The Boy Who Would Be King, right? And then as you keep working your way through this, like I said, I'll try to highlight this as we go through the story, but some of the plot progressions within my story are directly pulled from Harry Potter. Basically what I did is I reread Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, and I just took notes on how J.K. Rowling, how she progressed Harry's story to get him from point A to B. And I basically just kind of used that as a trajectory for David's character as well, right? So in my attempts to flesh out the story that we have in Scripture, I realized that there were certain things in Scripture that basically naturally followed this same plot line. But then I said, okay, well, I want to flesh this out. And since I think that what J.K. Rowling did in Harry Potter was so expert, I said, well, what did she do to flesh things out? And then I said, okay, well, what would be the biblical equivalent of that? And then I basically took inspiration from that. And so you see that throughout the entirety of this thing. And so that's basically what this is, right? So basically, as I scroll through this PowerPoint, you'll notice that there is a chapter title in the top right of each slide. And that is basically the Harry Potter title that this one is slightly inspired by. And so if you want to have a better understanding of exactly how my chapter would play out, go read that chapter in Harry Potter and you'll have a better idea of it. But that's just kind of fun. But you will see that there are some differences, right? My book was going to begin with an introduction, which we'll talk about in a second. And then I had it split into 3 different parts. And these 3 different parts are basically 3 different large movements in the story of David's life, right? Or not David's life, right? Because really, the first book in my planned series on David actually more or less covered the first season of the House of David, right? Because it started with Saul being rejected as king in a slightly different way, though. We'll talk about that. But then it ended with the David and Goliath story, right? And so really my first book directly correlated with the first season of House of David, which is kind of fun. And so part 1 is the House of Bread. That's the one we're going to be talking about today. We're just going to go through part 1. And then part 2 is the Stone Circle, which we'll be talking about in the next video. And then part 3 was the Invaders, which we'll talk about at the very end. And basically each of those covered different portions of David's early story, right? The House of Bread is more dealing with his calling, right, and his anointing. The Stone Circle is his time in Saul's court. And then the Invaders is him going against Goliath, right? And so those are the 3 different primary movements in my story. And you'll notice that they kind of do, once again, correlate to 3 large movements in Harry Potter, right? If you're going through it, that part 1 is more or less Harry going from the Muggle world to Hogwarts, right? And then part 2 is him getting used to Hogwarts, right? So the time in Saul's court. And then part 3 of Philosopher's Stone is basically, him going down into basically the chambers underneath the castle and going and facing off against the man with 2 faces, right? And so it really is the same movements. I just kind of mapped it out a little bit more. And my book would have been longer than the Philosopher's Stone, because once again, it's not meant for kids. It'd be a lot more fleshed out. But I just want to highlight that because I want to give credit where credit's due. I did take a lot of inspiration in my version of the story, and I'm going to be highlighting that throughout this. That's kind of how I write outlines, right? Whenever I write outlines for stories I want to write, I say, think of this one scene right here, and you'll understand what I'm going for. So, that being said, let's get into the story itself. I began with an introduction, and if you want me to share this introduction with y'all, I actually can do that, because the introduction is the only thing of this book that I have actually written so far that perfectly captures the mood that I was wanting to go for with the book itself. I've tried writing several other things. I've done several drafts of the rest of the book, but it's never quite captured what I've wanted. But I do have a solid introduction, and so if you want me to just like read that to y'all, I would love to do it. It's really short. But basically, the introduction would be a tribute. And basically, the book opens with a nostalgic, sorrowful eulogy from a first-person narrator describing his immense respect for one of the most amazing people in the world. And really, it's supposed to be a plot twist about halfway through the introduction. It's only about like 2 or 3 pages long. But as you're reading it, since you know that you're going into a book about David, you're expecting that this is somebody else talking about David. But as you read the introduction, it's revealed that this is actually an elderly David who is reflecting on his life, and he's talking not about himself, but he's talking about the prophet Samuel. And ultimately, at the end of this introduction, David dedicates the book to Samuel, and he says that he misses him, right? And basically, this is supposed to set the mood for the entire story. And throughout this introduction, you get the impression that David is a flawed man who loves God, and he has a lot of regrets in life. But one thing he does not regret at all is his time that he spent with the prophet Samuel. And Samuel's going to be a much more prominent figure in David's life in my story than he necessarily is just in Scripture. In Scripture, we only really see David and Samuel interacting at key moments. But I'm going to have Samuel just popping in every now and then in the story just to check in on David and stuff like that. Because I really want Samuel to be the one who... he's kind of like a mixture of the Hagrid and Dumbledore figures in Harry Potter, right? To where he's this wise mentor, but he's also the person who helps bring David into this whole new world and helps him understand who God is and what God's goals are. Because Samuel was a great leader for the people of Israel. And so I really want that mentor level thing to be there between David and Samuel. And so this introduction just kind of sets the mood to where it's an elderly David who is writing, and basically you realize that this is him telling this story. And one reason he wants to tell this story is to honor the man who really helped introduce him to God, right? To where by the time we meet David at the beginning of the story, he's already a man after God's own heart. He already loves God, but he doesn't have access to God in the way that he would like to have it. And it's not until Samuel intervenes into his story that David truly begins to get to know God better, right? And so in many ways, this story is supposed to be a love letter to Samuel. And that's kind of how I planned out all these books, right? To where I think I have like 3 or 4 books planned about just the life of David. The first one was going to be dedicated to Samuel. The second one was going to be dedicated to, I think it was going to be Jonathan. The third one was going to be dedicated to, I want to say Uriah the Hittite. And then I think the fourth one was going to be dedicated to Solomon. To where each of them were like going to be dedicated to key figures in David's life. Maybe it wasn't going to be to Solomon. Maybe it was going to be to Absalom. I don't remember. I think it was going to be Absalom because each of them were dedicated to people who were dead by the time the story was being written, right? So Samuel dies before, well, like, yeah, that don't make sense. We don't need to get into that. But yeah, so that's kind of what this introduction was going to be. It was going to be very brief. And it was supposed to kind of just like give the whole story an extra sense of weight. And once again, after you've read this introduction, you'll realize this does not have the Harry Potter vibe, right? And so while Harry Potter is kind of part of the inspiration for it, it does not feel like Harry Potter at all. And that leads us into part 1, the House of Bread. You'll see in Hebrew there, I've got some text, and the Hebrew word is Bethlehem, because Bethlehem means the house of bread. And each of these parts is named after a certain location or a certain people, right? So part 1 is Bethlehem, which means the house of bread. Part 2 is Gilgal, which means, it doesn't directly mean stone circle, but it means like a heap of stones, and so I just called it the stone circle. And then part 3 is the Philistines, which means the invaders, right? And so part 1 is the house of bread, and that's because that is where we're going to start. We are going to start in the house of bread with David, but actually we're not going to start with David himself. Chapter 1 is the boy who would be king, and in many ways, it is similar to chapter 1 of Harry Potter, the boy who lived. In that chapter, if you go read it, you'll realize that you do not meet Harry Potter until the very end of that chapter. Instead, that entire chapter is setting the context for who Harry is. And so the main goal of this chapter is also to establish context for the house of David and for the house of Saul. Basically, for each slide that's beginning a chapter, I'll put in green text what the main goal of the chapter was, just so you know what I'm trying to get across here. But yeah, the main goal here is to establish context for David's family and also for the house of Saul. And so if you're reading chapter 1 of Harry Potter, you'll be introduced to the Dursleys, you'll be introduced to Dumbledore, you'll be introduced to the defeat of Voldemort and what's going on to that and how people are reacting, and you'll be introduced to this character who is called the Boy Who Lived, right? And that's going to be Harry Potter at the very end of the chapter. Well, that's the same way with my chapter, right? My chapter would be a lot longer because I need to give a lot more details and a lot more context, but in general, we're going to see who Jesse is and why he is at the beginning, like why he is the way he is at the beginning of our story, and we're also going to be introduced to Saul and who Saul is, and why he is the way he is at the beginning of our story. And so part 1 of this chapter is the rise of Jesse. Basically, there's 2 parts to this chapter. Part 1 is the rise of Jesse, and it basically is an introduction to Jesse, who is presented in my story as a Bethlehemite born to wealthy landowners, right? He's descended from Boaz. And then his wife, Nitzevet, who is a poor girl from a neighboring village. And basically part 1 is their love story, right? It's an overview of their years together, presented as an idealistic and dreamy. And basically, if I was wanting to give you an image to picture in your mind, just think of the opening montage of the movie Up, right? You know that opening montage that's just like really beautiful and sweet, and then it ends in tragedy? That's basically what part 1 of my story is. To where the part 1 is so sweet that it almost presents things as too good to be true, and then part 2 is going to pull that out from under you. That's going in a way that's going to dramatically shift things for absolutely everybody, right? And so these opening pages, they're just like a sweeping narrative that are telling us who Jesse is, who Nitzevet is, and why their life is so perfect. Very similar to how the opening pages of Harry Potter tell us about who the Dursleys are, and it tells you the essential things about them, right? Jesse and Nitzevet are going to be presented in a much more positive light than the Dursleys are, but it serves the same purpose, right? We're going to see them meeting and falling in love, marrying, building a life together. We're going to see how they built a family. They're going to have 7 sons and 2 daughters. One thing that I'm going to do in this book is I'm going to also work through some of the textual issues that we have in the Bible, right? Because in some places in the Bible, it says that David was the 7th son of Jesse. But in other places, like in 1 Samuel 16, it says that 7 sons passed before Samuel, and then they went and got David, and so that would imply David is the 8th son. Well, in my version of the story, I'm going to explain that issue, right? And so I'm going to explain how Jesse has 7 sons, but also 8 sons, right? And so we're going to read how they built a family. They have 7 sons and they have 2 daughters. You're not going to meet these guys quite yet, but you're going to be kind of introduced to them. You're going to read very briefly how Saul became king and how Jesse joined the army. In my version, Jesse is a military leader in Saul's army. We'll talk about that. And we're going to talk about how Jesse and his eldest sons joined the army, right? Like I said, this opening chapter, it covers multiple years, right? So we get to see Jesse as a young teen, and then he grows and he gets married, and then like we just get to see a lot of stuff. It's not going in detail about all this. It's basically like an opening montage, right? That's how I would have presented this. I guess you could think of it like what is it? If you're watching The Chosen, is it season 2, episode, I want to say maybe 4, right? The one that opens up where it's introducing you to Simon Z and Jesse. I forgot the guy's name is Jesse in that too. But basically like that introduction scene, that's kind of how I visualize this opening chapter in my head, right? It's just a sweeping montage letting you know the core details about this, right? Saul becomes king, Jesse joins the army, Jesse's sons grow older, they join the army too. And then you would see how Nitzevet struggled with the last baby, and ultimately they agree that baby was going to be their last, right? So they've got 7 sons, 2 daughters, she's pumping these babies out like crazy, and then finally they agree, all right, maybe we should be done having babies because she really struggles at the end, right? Whenever she gives birth to that last kid, it was not an easy birth, and therefore they realize maybe we need to call it quits right there. And so you just got this idea that Jesse, he's wealthy, he's successful, he has the perfect life that he's always wanted. And then we also see how Jesse is rising through the ranks. There's a typo there, but that's okay. Jesse's rising through the ranks of Saul's army, and basically his life is everything he wants it to be. Which then leads to part 2 of my chapter, which is the fall of Jesse, right? Because I'm wanting to explain why Jesse is the way he is at the beginning of the David story, and therefore you got to rip all these things away from him. And so this is where things slow down a little bit, and the montage ends, and we pick up at this one crucial moment in Jesse's life. We see Jesse on the battlefield. He's filled with nerves because this is a really big day. And on one hand, he and Saul's cousin Abner are competing to be Saul's chief commanders, and the odds are in Jesse's favor, right? So we'll just read very briefly that Apparently, Jesse has risen through the ranks to where he is literally in competition against Saul's own cousin to be the chief commander in Saul's army. And everybody thinks that Jesse's going to get it because he's simply the better officer, right? Even though Saul has favoritism towards Abner, people still think Jesse's going to get it because he's that good of a guy, right? And so this is a really important day for Jesse. But he has other reasons to be nervous too, because on the other hand, back home, it turns out that Nitzevet is pregnant again. This one was not planned. This one was a surprise. And Jesse is nervous about her health, right? Because ultimately, the last pregnancy didn't go so well, right? And so he's nervous because on one hand, it's a really big day. He's about to get this promotion. On the other hand, his wife is back home and he's not sure if she's going to make it through this pregnancy, right? So he has very good reason to be nervous, right? Meanwhile, King Saul is introduced here and he seems nervous too. He's this imposing figure, taller than everybody in Israel. He's on the battlefield, but he seems nervous and he's pacing frantically as if he's waiting for something. Yet Jesse doesn't fully know what he's waiting for. If Jesse was more locked in the moment, he would know what Saul is nervous for. But Jesse's preoccupied with Nitzevet back home because, that's his love and stuff. And so he's thinking about her. But it turns out what Saul is waiting for is he's waiting for the prophet Samuel. And the prophet Samuel is running late. Jesse ultimately, at the battlefield, as they're getting ready to go into battle, Jesse receives news that his wife is in labor. And even though he knows that this could cost him the promotion, he gets permission to leave the battlefield. And Saul is so preoccupied with something that he's doing that he says, you know what, just go, right? Even though this is one of his leading officers, he says, go, I've got other stuff I got to do. And so Jesse leaves the battlefield in this crucial moment to go visit his wife. Meanwhile, Saul is back at the battlefield. And what Saul is doing is he is so frustrated that the prophet Samuel has not shown up that he begins to get things together to offer a sacrifice. And this is one of the key differences that sets my story apart from the House of David show. Because the House of David show, episode 1, it did choose to begin with God's rejection of Saul, but it took God's rejection from 1 Samuel 15. I actually wanted to go back a little bit further, and I wanted to take the rejection story from 1 Samuel 13. That's why I thought it was so cool that I was like, oh, we both started in the same place, but just in we started with the same idea, but at different places, right? And so I'm going to 1 Samuel 13 because there's really two big blunders that Saul makes, right? 1 Samuel 13, he offers an unlawful sacrifice. 1 Samuel 15, he fails to kill the Amalekites, right? And so House of David show, they did 1 Samuel 15. I was wanting to go with 1 Samuel 13 because I really like that story. And so as Jesse leaves, Saul is preparing the sacrifice. He's going to offer it to God. And then the prophet Samuel is going to arrive. Right. And then in my narrative, right, this is where the chapter is coming to a head. These two events are going to take place at the exact same time, to where it's like cutting back and forth between the two. Ultimately, on one hand, Samuel is going to arrive. He's going to rebuke Saul for what he's done. He's going to say, you have no business offering this sacrifice, right? You're not a priest, right? And then he's going to promise that his kingdom will not endure and that God has instead chosen a man after his own heart who will replace Saul as king. And at that exact same moment, over in Bethlehem, Nitzevet is going to die in childbirth. And in her dying breath, she is going to name the child David. And to me, this was like a poetic way of making it to where the moment that Saul is rejected is the moment that David is born. And so the moment that Samuel says God has appointed a man after his own heart is the moment that that man after God's own heart is born. Right. And so I wanted to make it super poetic. So those moments happen at the same time. Whereas I imagine that the 1 Samuel 15 event took place a little bit closer to the events of David and Goliath than this. And therefore I kind of just used I was like, okay, 1 Samuel 13 probably took place, a lot earlier. And so it allowed me to kind of work that way. And so I thought that was kind of fun. And that would be ultimately the end of chapter 1. And that's why I call it The Boy Who Would Be King. Right. To where just like in Harry Potter, you're introduced to this character who somehow defied Voldemort. And in some way, he is the boy who lived. And there's like this special aura around him. Well, I wanted this chapter to introduce us to David and introduce, he is also very special. And he is also very unique. And he will be set apart. And he is destined for greatness, even though we don't even know who this kid is yet. Which then leads to chapter 2, which is going to pick up 15 years later. And the main goal of this chapter is to showcase what makes David unique. And in many ways, this chapter is hyper-focused on David himself. And for that reason, I want you to think of like season 1, episode 3 of The Chosen, right? That's the episode where Jesus is with the little children, right? To where episodes 1 and 2 of The Chosen, you get brief glimpses of Jesus, but it's not till episode 3 that you actually just get this one episode that's about Jesus himself. Well, that's what chapter 2 is of my book, right? You're just focusing on David and you're getting to see what makes him so special. Very similar to chapter 2 of Harry Potter, where it's called The Vanishing Glass, and that's basically where you get to see Harry Potter. There's a time jump. It's been 11 years, and basically you get to see that weird things happen whenever you're around Harry Potter, right? You can go to a little museum or like to a zoo, and the glass will disappear, and basically he's a wizard, right? But he doesn't know it. And so David is also going to be very different, but he doesn't know it either, right? He's not a wizard, but he is different. And so it picks up 15 years later, and this is our introduction to David himself. And one thing that I wanted to establish very early on in my story is that David is a very different figure, and I wanted to explore what it means to be a man after God's own heart. And this is something that I did critique the show about a little bit, because while we did get glimpses of what made David special in the show, at least so far, I'm only 5 episodes in, again, at the time I'm recording this, but so far, I haven't quite gotten what I wanted whenever I'm like wanting to say, like, what makes this guy a man after God's own heart? And one benefit that you have whenever you are writing a book versus telling a TV show is that you have internal monologue, right? And whenever, like, a big part of the David story is that, man sees the external appearance, God looks to the heart, right? And so sometimes there are things inside of a person that you just can't see on the outside. And so through a book format, you could actually explore that by just talking about internal dialogue and stuff like that. And you can actually see exactly what's going on in David's head. And so we're introduced to David here. He sits against a tree atop a hill. He's strumming his lyre and he's humming a song, but he's struggling to come up with the lyrics. You want to remember that because that's going to come back later, right? He's humming this song. He's got the melody, but he doesn't quite have the lyrics yet, but he's trying to come up with them. He enjoys a playful banter with his sheep, right? He's surrounded by the sheep, and I just kind of wanted to establish this like youthful innocence to David. He calls each of them by name. He speaks to them as if they understood what he was saying. I kind of want David to be a little bit goofy and just like have this like childlike innocence about him, to where you get the impression he doesn't have a lot of friends, and that the sheep are in many ways his friends. And he almost cares for them as deeply as if they were humans, right? So he knows all their names. He jokes around with them. They don't understand what he's saying, but he's just goofing off anyways. And then at one point throughout the chapter, he's going to tend to a wounded sheep, and he's going to be singing to it as he does so. You get the idea that this is a guy who cares for the small things of the earth. He's very thoughtful, very caring, very tender, and he always has a song on the edge of his lips, right? He's always singing everywhere he goes. And then, as the sun sets, he climbs back into the tree and he begins to strum his lyre again, humming that same melody, but still failing to come up with the lyrics. And this is where you get to explore his internal thoughts. As he's laying there on the tree strumming, he's going to begin to reflect on his circumstances. And what we see is that apparently Jesse lost everything the day David was born. He lost his wife, right? His wife died during childbirth, but then he lost his job because he abandoned the battlefield, right? And Saul let him leave, but he did not get the job promotion. And not only did he get the job promotion, but Saul didn't even remember letting him leave, and so he got kicked out of the army. And since his wife was dead and gone, Jesse actually had to return home to take care of the house. And since he was no longer out there able to like serve and take care of everything, well, it turns out that he started losing money too. He wasn't able to bring in an income for his house because he was trying to take care of it. And now he is a single parent who has like 10 children and he's trying to deal with all this different stuff. And then as the years pass, Saul becomes more of a tyrant and things become very hard on Jesse. And so from Jesse's perspective, everything got worse the day that David was born, right? He lost his wife, his job, his wealth. And in many ways, though it's unfair, he places all that weight on David, and that would explain why him and David are distant. And then we read also that 7 of David's siblings want absolutely nothing to do with him, right? 6 of his brothers and 1 of his sisters. Eliab, Aminadab, Shammah, and Zeruiah. And then I just created names for some of the other brothers. We don't know all of David's brothers' names. We only know some of them. But we got Nethanel, Radai, and Ozim. They want nothing to do with David, probably mainly as a result of their father's influence, right? However, there are going to be some of them that are a little bit different, right? David has 1 brother and 1 sister who are nice to him. The brother's name is Jabez, and he is going to be, in my story, he's Zeruiah's twin. Not super important, but I'm just trying to like flesh them out and make them all distinct. And so Jabez is Zeruiah's twin, and he's really nice to David. He's going to be like a confidant to David, and he's the one brother who's actually going to give David the time of day. And then Abigail is David's younger sister, and she's also nice to him too. She actually like looks up to him, even though she's a little bit older than David. But then we see that Jabez and David are really the closer of the two, right? And so David doesn't have a lot of friends, but Jabez and him are very close. And the siblings are not going to all be fleshed out in this chapter themselves, right? There's too many characters to flesh all of them out right now, but over the course of the story, they will be fleshed out. And what we see is that Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah are in the army because they're the only ones who are old enough to be in the army. They have to be over 20, right? And so they're in the army. Zeruiah is married and she has 2 kids. And there's a third on the way, right? These are going to ultimately be Joab and his brothers, right? And then Jabez is eager to join the army soon, right? So Jabez, again, is Zeruiah's twin. Zeruiah is of marriageable age, so she's probably between like 15 to 18. She's already got a few kids. Well, Jabez, he's like 19 years old, right? And so that would make Zeruiah 19, right? And so Jabez, he's about to go in the army, and he is so pumped to go into the army. And he's just excited to serve, right? That's like what his thing is, and he talks with David about that a lot. Ultimately, what happens is that David is going to fall asleep while he's like reflecting on his life circumstances while he's up in the tree. And then he awakes the next morning to bleating in the distance, followed by a roar. And because David is such a good shepherd, he immediately knows which sheep is missing, and without hesitation, he's going to jump into action. And this is kind of fun. The House of David, season 1, episode 1, had David killing a lion. Well, so does my version of the story. And so it's kind of cool how we decided to introduce David in the same way. David's going to leap out of the tree, and he leaves the rest of the sheep. He sprints down the hill in search of the one missing one, right? This is kind of an allusion to, Jesus' parable of the 99 sheep and the one lost one, right? He leaves the 99 to go in search for the one. He finds the sheep just in time to save it from the lion. After using his sling to distract and weaken the lion, he ultimately ends up killing it with his bare hands. But kind of like they depicted it in the show, I wasn't planning on really like detailing how that fight went down. Instead, I was going to have David like jumping at the lion, and then it was going to like cut to him like carrying the lion's pelt or something like super macho. I don't know. But I wasn't going to detail it, right? And so I was like, oh, that's funny. I remember being kind of disappointed when they didn't show it in the show, but then I was like, oh, wait, I wasn't going to show it in my version of the story either. And so I thought that was kind of fun. Internal monologue throughout this entire narrative is going to demonstrate David's reliance on God, right? This is where I'm really leaning on that, to where obviously David doesn't have anybody to talk to in these scenes, but he's going to be praying. And he's going to be like, as he's going against this lion, David realizes he is outmatched, and he realizes he stands no chance. He's going to be praying to God, saying, God, help me save my sheep. Help me, serve my father by taking care of the sheep. And so you're going to see that David, despite all his family's done to him, he still respects them. He still cares for them, and he still serves God. He's not bitter about his life circumstances. He's content, and he's happy to be a shepherd. You get the idea that this guy, he's already a man after God's own heart, right? Even though he's a very simple man living a very simple life. As David carries the sheep back to the hill, and basically, he's exhausted from the early morning's work, he's going to find his brother Jabez, right? And Jabez has come looking for him. Jabez is waiting at the base of the tree, and he says something totally unexpected. Jabez says, the prophet Samuel is looking for you. End of chapter 2. All right, we cut to chapter 3. And chapter 3 is the prophet from Ramah. And it is comparable to chapter 3 in the Philosopher's Stone called Letters from No One. In chapter 3 of Harry Potter, basically this is where Harry starts getting his letters from Hogwarts. And we see that the Dursleys are resisting those, like him getting those letters. Well, in the same way, this is where we're going to see that ultimately Samuel is going to realize that, God is going to tell Samuel that Israel needs a new king. And so Samuel is going to begin to make his way to invite David to become king. But David's family is going to resist this, right? Just like the Dursleys resisted it. And so this story is basically going to explain how Samuel got to Bethlehem and why he was looking for David to begin with, which is basically the question at the end of chapter 2, right? Because we're like, wait, Samuel's looking for me? Well, this is going to explain that, right? And so this is really our big introduction to Samuel. We did see him in the introduction to the book, but this is our introduction to him proper. He's presented as like a witty, strange, and kind, yet profoundly deep and intense character. And I kind of want you to think of Merlin Gandalf and Dumbledore all blended into one character. From my perspective, I wanted Samuel to be the strangest character in the entire book, and I wanted it to be off-putting, especially because in the introduction of the book, David has so many good things to say about him, and he has such like reverence for Samuel that whenever you meet him, it's almost supposed to like confuse you, because like whenever you meet Samuel, he's supposed to be like, wait, what? This is the guy that the guy in the introduction respected? Like it's supposed to be offsetting, like off-putting, because I want Samuel to be weird. I want him to be very strange, to where he like cracks like these weird jokes that nobody gets. And really, to me, that is just like my way of depicting a prophet, right? A person who has this insight into the mind of God that nobody else understands. To where he's going to be a man of very intense passion. Like he's going to be the happiest of people, but also he can get the angriest, because to him, the slightest amount of sin is like the greatest amount of like evil, because he understands the righteousness of God, but then he also understands the grace of God, and therefore he can be happier than anybody else. And then there's certain jokes that he makes that just nobody gets, but he also understands people more deeply. And so I wanted Samuel to be a very interesting character. And so you really have to take a bunch of different other characters and like blend them together in order to truly understand what I was going for. And that's honestly one thing that I struggled with, because in my head, I knew how I wanted Samuel to be, but I had a tough time actually translating that into like the text of a book. And basically what we see is we hear Samuel's side of the story, and this is going to be kind of like another little montage, which is a selective summary of 1 Samuel 7 through 15, where basically we're going to see from Samuel's perspective, what it was like leading the people of Israel, what it felt like whenever they rejected him, what his feelings were whenever God chose Saul to lead, how he felt about Saul's leadership, how he came to support Saul, how he came to love Saul, how he actually really loved Saul despite all of Saul's faults, and then ultimately the different rejections, right? He's going to briefly touch on what we read about in the introduction, and then he's also going to bring up another rejection that we haven't read about so far, but it's the rejection that we saw in the first episode, the House of David, right? And so basically we just get to see from Samuel's perspective, the last several decades have been really, really tough. Right? He was already an old man when this all started, and now he's even older, and he just realizes that Saul has not been a good king, but he still desperately loves Saul. And so, in the present, right, cutting to the present part of the story, or more precisely, I guess, a few hours before the end of the previous chapter, Samuel receives a vision from God akin to the opening of Isaiah chapter 6. I wanted to, once again, make these stories really weird. And so Samuel is going to be praying, and then all of a sudden he's going to find himself in the throne room of God, kind of like Isaiah chapter 6, whenever, there's like lightning and thunder and like the cherubim or seraphim and stuff. I wanted it to be something like that. And in this vision, God is going to tell Samuel it's time to appoint a new king. So he's going to send Samuel down to Bethlehem to go and find this king. He's going to go to Bethlehem, where he is welcomed with suspicion, because everybody knows that Samuel and Saul had a falling out. And so they're like, do you come in peace? Because they're like, we don't really like, I don't know, like you being here is not necessarily the best look for us. Right. And so they would respond to him very similarly to how the people do in the house of David. And ultimately Samuel's going to seek out the house of Jesse. Right. And there he is going to meet with Jesse and his 7 sons, one by one, each one passed before the prophet, until he ultimately says, do you have another son? And so this is just a very brief summary of this chapter, but you're pretty familiar with the narrative plot points here, right? He's going to get there. The sons are going to pass before him. I'd probably have like some witty internal stuff, like every time one of Jesse's sons passes in front of Samuel, he's going to become like at first he's going to be impressed by Eliab. And he's like, wow, now that's a man. And then God's going to say, that's not what I'm looking for. And as each of Jesse's sons passes before Samuel's going to become like more in tune with what God is looking for. And so he's going to like kind of begin like roasting the sons, because like he's no longer looking at their appearance. He's looking at their hearts, and like they're filthy. And so it would be kind of a way where like Samuel's just like severely unimpressed. And then he's kind of insulted, and he's like kind of confused. And he's like, Jesse, hold up. I told you to bring all your sons out here. Where is like, is it possible that you, for some reason, like, misunderstood me? Like, you already have a bunch of sons, but is it possible you have another son that you just didn't bring out here? And so it kind of ended like this cliffhanger, like, do you have another? And that would kind of bring us back to the present point, which then leads us into chapter 4, right? The Keeper of the Way. And this is a clever allusion to Genesis chapter 18 verse 19, where basically God says the reason why he picked Abraham from all the peoples of the earth is because he wanted to appoint Abraham and his seed, the Israelites, to be the guardians of the way of Yahweh, the keepers of the way of Yahweh. Well, chapter 4 of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone is called The Keeper of the Keys, and that's a reference to Hagrid, right? And so just like in chapter 4 of Harry Potter, Hagrid arrives for Harry, well, in chapter 4 of this, of my book, Samuel arrives for David, and he basically is going to say, hey, this is what your job is, and they're going to have a discussion, right? So the main goal of this chapter is to set up the remainder of the story and the saga itself, right? So it's going to set up the rest of the story because it's going to basically show David that he's special, but it's going to set up the rest of the saga because it's going to let us know what David is ultimately destined for. David's going to arrive at the house where his entire family is gathered. His brothers look uneasy and annoyed. His dad is quiet and thoughtful. He looks kind of guilty. One thing I want to do with Jesse is that this moment with Samuel changes everything because while Jesse has strayed from God, Samuel's presence there in many ways is a wake-up call, and he begins to realize that he has harbored a lot of bitterness against David, and in many ways, even before Samuel anoints David, Jesse's going to know what's coming, right? Because Jesse realizes he did neglect David and he did leave David out there. And so even by the time that David shows up here, something's beginning to work in Jesse's heart, and it's not going to be revealed in chapter 4, but you can tell that something's going on to where Jesse, he's got some regrets, and he's going to realize, wow, to me, it's very similar. This is actually going to come up later in the book. Jesse and David's relationship is going to be, to me, very similar to Jacob and Benjamin in the book of Genesis. And the way that I'm kind of visualizing it in my head is that for all these years, Jesse viewed David as this curse, right? His life was terrible the moment David was born, since that moment. But in many ways, what's going to be happening in his heart is he's going to begin to view David as a gift and realize really what he should have done is he should have realized that David was the final gift that his wife gave him. And he should have treasured David above all. And he should have realized, wow, yes, my life fell apart, but at least I have this child. But instead, he just cast all the blame on the child. And so Jesse is going to be a very broken figure, and that's going to play a part later in this book. But he looks very guilty, right? That's all I want to highlight. Samuel sees David, and he's immediately overcome by emotion, and he anoints David as king immediately, right? He sees David, he's like, wow, this is the guy. He anoints David as king, and everybody is shocked. And ultimately, what's going to happen is that David and Samuel end up going for a walk. This is something that I kind of wish had happened in the house of David, but they didn't really do. But David and Samuel go for a walk, and Samuel takes time to answer many of David's questions and concerns, right? Because David would have a lot of questions. And I wanted to give time to explore that. I didn't want Samuel to just show up and be like, hey, you're future king. Peace. No, I wanted them to have time to flesh it out. And that's exactly what's going to happen here, right? So David shares his questions. He shares his concerns. But at the same time, there are many questions that Samuel doesn't answer, right? David's going to have 1,000,001 questions. And Samuel's going to say, okay, I can answer that one. And there's going to be other questions that he's going to say, you don't need to know that quite yet, or it'll be revealed in time, or trust in God. So Samuel's going to be somebody who, David's going to appreciate his authenticity, right? He's going to be very honest, right? There are some things that he wants to say, and David might be frustrated that there's some questions that he doesn't answer, but he very quickly realizes that Samuel's the type of guy who will only say what God wants him to say, and David has respect for that. David and Samuel will take an immediately liking to each other, and in many ways to me, they will be kindred spirits. These are people who both feel rejected, right? Samuel was a natural leader who loved God, and he was rejected by the people. And David, we haven't seen it yet, but he will also be a natural leader who loves God, and he's rejected by his family. And so they're both kind of goofy. They're both kind of weird. They're both misunderstood by everybody. And as a result, just being around each other, they begin to like each other, and they have a kindred, they have kindred connection. To where David actually feels closer to Samuel after this one encounter than he has felt to any of his own actual blood family. During this conversation, Samuel will lay down the expectations and responsibility of being a king, recounting Israel's history, right? He will basically say, hey, it was never God's intention for there to be a king. And Samuel was the first king, and therefore he had the goal, he had the difficult task of, trying to figure out what it even looks like to be a king whenever technically the nation already has a king, God, right? And so Samuel will come across as very sympathetic towards Saul, and that will also influence David's thought, whereas David will not view Saul as a villain. He will view Saul as somebody almost to be pitied, right? To where David's going to love Saul. And Samuel lays down the expectation, responsibility of being a king, recounting Israel's history, talking about his own personal frustrations. He's going to be kind of vulnerable with David. He's going to say how he felt rejected whenever the people asked for a king, and how God said, no, they didn't reject you, they rejected me. And Samuel's just going to be very honest, and that's going to be something that David really appreciates. This is not a guy who's concealing anything from him unless it needs to be concealed. David, meanwhile, is going to be overwhelmed by the entire process. Like you get the impression that he was totally content in the shepherd's fields, and in many ways, he would prefer to stay in the shepherd's fields. Yet at the same time, he's going to be submissive to God's will, and he's going to be eager to learn more, right? So like, he's going to be like an optimist, right? He's going to be like, you know what? This is like, from his perspective, this is not an ideal development, but he's going to make the best of it. And he's honored to be chosen by God. He has a million questions. He voices feelings of inadequacy and a hesitancy to appear treasonous, right? So he doesn't feel like he is the guy for the job. And also he doesn't he doesn't have anything against the king. And he realizes that if he is the anointed king and there's currently a king already, that puts him in a very difficult situation because it looks like treason. And he says, I don't want to appear treasonous. He has this intense, undying respect for King Saul, simply by means of God having anointed Saul to be king, right? David has never met Saul. He's never seen Saul. Honestly, he doesn't even really know much about Saul's politics. But from his perspective, if God has anointed Saul as king, Saul is somebody who deserves to be respected and served. And therefore, David has this real strong conviction, like, I don't want to appear treasonous. And that's because very early on, I want to establish in my story that David will never kill Saul. If he ends up on the throne, it will have to be by another means. And the reason I want to establish that early on is because if you're just trying to tell the story of David from a strictly like a modern perspective, this story would naturally only end in one way. Think about like the story with Harry and Voldemort, right? It has to end with a final clash between them where one kills the other, right? That's kind of how it has to go. When you're watching Star Wars, right? It has to be Luke versus Darth Vader and Palpatine. It has to be the hero versus the villain. And so if you're reading the David story, you'll notice it doesn't end that way, right? There's never a moment where David and Saul fight each other, right? And so I need to establish very early on, it's never going to happen because I don't want my audience to have a false expectation, right? I don't want them to think that this story ends with David and Saul fighting. Instead, I want to basically turn the story into a mystery story to where David says, I'm going to serve Saul, yet I'm going to end up on the throne. And if I end up on the throne, it cannot be by my own devices or my own political maneuverings. And so to me, I wanted to take the story from simply being an action story and turning it into a mystery. Because now the question is, and the tension is, how is David going to end up on the throne if he doesn't force his way there? Because David's just like a random shepherd from backwoods Bethlehem. How is he going to end up on the throne without killing the king, right? How is he going to navigate this whole situation without coming out as a treasonous person? How is he going to go into this with an untainted reputation? And to me, that is a very intriguing story. And then it also establishes very early on that Saul's going to have to die in another way, right? There's not going to be this big confrontation there. Instead, the battle is a spiritual one, right? And David is saying, I'm going to trust God to get me there, but there are certain things I cannot do. And it's because of his honor to God, right? He will not oppose Saul because Saul is the Lord's anointed. I want to establish that very early on. And I want to make it clear that David really has no desire for the throne. He only wants to take up the throne because God wants him to take it, right? He will do this out of submission to God because he is naturally a shepherd at heart, right? He will serve where he is called to serve, right? If his dad puts him on the shepherd's fields, he'll take care of the sheep. If God puts him on the throne, he'll take care of the people. And those are things I want to establish about David's character. All right. David ultimately returns to his tree that night, and finally, he has lyrics for that song, right? Remember that song that for several chapters he's been wrestling through and he doesn't know the lyrics? Well, finally he has them, and it's Psalm 8, right? And basically Psalm 8 is the one where David's looking up at creation. He says, what is man that you are mindful of him, the son of man that you care for him? And so basically you have David out in the shepherd's fields looking up at the sky, realizing how big the universe is, and he's amazed that the God of the universe sees him. Right? He's just this lowly shepherd, yet God has appointed him to be the king. And so finally he has lyrics, and it's Psalm 8. And much of, I tried to, weave David's Psalms into the story in practical ways to where it makes sense why he would sing that song in that particular place. All right. Chapter 5, the unexpected invite. The main goals of this chapter are to, firstly, see how David feels about these changes, and secondly, to set in motion the events which bring David into contact with Saul. Chapter 5 of Harry Potter is called Diagon Alley, and basically that is the moment where Harry exits the old world and enters into the new world, and he begins to prepare for going to Hogwarts, right? It's basically where Hagrid and him leave the Dursleys, and they ultimately go and, go to Diagon Alley, and they get they get Hedwig and a wand and stuff like that. Well, that's the same purpose of this chapter as well, right? It is David's exit from his old world in Bethlehem and his entrance into the new world. Well, basically, it's him preparing to go off to Saul's courts. So over the course of the next several months, nothing really changes. David returns to the fields, and while his father and his stepmother are kinder to him because of what happened with Samuel, his siblings are more severe, likely out of envy. You'll notice that I mentioned the stepmother there, and that is because, very similar to the House of David, I did have this plot development where I had David's mother die in childbirth, right? They had her die in a different way. But I had David's mother die, but we do know later on in 1 Samuel that it mentions David's father and mother as being present in the story. And so basically, in my version of the story, Jesse does get remarried later on, basically just because, it's not even out of love. He just gets remarried because he needs help around the house, and he needs to provide. And so he ultimately gets married again. And so David does have a stepmother in this, and that would explain why his mother is mentioned later on, because he views her as a mother. It's the only mother he ever knew. So while his father and his stepmother are kinder to him, his siblings are more severe, likely out of envy. They're very skeptical about his situation, and they show more allegiance to Saul than they do to Samuel himself, right? And so from their perspective, they're like, Samuel, he's weird, he's old, he's strange, he doesn't know what he's talking about. David, you are not going to be king. And so they're very dismissive of him, whereas Jesse seems to be willing to consider it a little bit more. Again, this is very similar to Jacob in regards to Joseph and his brothers, right? To where whenever Joseph told everybody his dream, the brothers dismissed it, but then Jacob was like, no, I'll consider that a little bit. So basically, they think that Samuel's gone crazy. Jabez is David's one confidant, right? One thing that I'm trying to emphasize a whole lot throughout these early chapters, and if you know anything about storytelling, you'll know where this is ultimately heading. You're not going to learn it in this section. But I really want to emphasize that Jabez and David are very, very close. They're really good friends. They spend long hours discussing things, and internal monologue teaches us more about David and how he views the world. This is not necessarily specifically just relevant to this section. It's just stuff that we learn about David to just help flesh out his character. We know that while David is passionate about God, his family isn't. I alluded to this earlier. Jesse used to be passionate about God, but he hasn't been as passionate as of late. But things are going to begin to change as a result of some of these developments. We also learn that David's illiterate, right? The only thing that he knows about God are from stories that he's overheard in passing or from observing creation, right? Everything he knows about God is simply hearsay, right? He has heard things from some of his family members. He's heard things in town, in the village, but he doesn't really know that much about God. He simply has observed creation, and he realizes that there's this creator who loves us, and gives us these things. And then for some reason that God has chosen Israel as a special people. That's basically all he knows. He doesn't know that much. He knows a little bit of some stories here and there, but he's not literate. He does not have any scrolls. So he wants to know more. But he doesn't know enough about God, right? To really, to have he has a deep relationship based off what little he knows, but he doesn't know as much as he would like to know. He's confused why God would pick someone as simple as himself, because he thinks that there are so many other people who are more highly equipped, right? There's priests and stuff who could be better, but for some reason God picked him. And that's going to basically set up stuff later on in the story where David is going to get access to the Word of God, and he's going to learn to read, and he's going to fall in love with the Word of God, and he's going to love the things that he learns. As David considers the responsibility of kingship, he develops a longing to better understand the Maker and his people. He spends most of his time shepherding and writing songs, but as the months begin to pass, he actually begins going into town and interacting with people. And this is because David realizes that being a king is more than simply wearing a crown, right? If he is going to be king, he's thinking through these things ahead of time, which I'm just trying to emphasize that David will be a good king. He's thinking through it ahead of time, and he says, if I'm going to be a king, that does not stop God from being king. And therefore, I want to know more about God so I can know how to lead as he would have me lead. And so he's going to be praying for things like this, right? God, give me wisdom. Help me understand, right? But then at the same time, he realizes that while he's really good at leading sheep, he only leads the sheep well because he knows the sheep and the sheep know him. And therefore, he needs to know the community better. And so he's going to feel this desire to go into town and to get to know the people of Bethlehem and to understand them better, because in many ways, he's been estranged, right? He's been the black sheep of his family. He doesn't even know his own family that well. And so he begins to interact with people more because he wants to know how to serve them best. And so even though he's only 15 years old, David is thinking of these things, and he's really trying to process what it would mean to be the best king he could possibly be. He has a very limited view of the world. That's another thing that we learned during this chapter. Basically, again, everything he knows about the outside world beyond his hill in Bethlehem is it's just stuff that he's heard from people, right? From his perspective, Gentiles have always been described like mythical beasts, right? Whenever people come back, like whenever his brothers come home from war and they talk about the Philistines, they almost talk about them as if they're like these like giant, like ugly ogre people, right? Like I want you to think, like, from David's perspective, the world is a fantasy world, right? Like that's one thing I wanted to do in the story. Like it's almost like a reversal of Harry Potter. Like Harry Potter starts off in a normal world and then he goes out into the world and realizes it's so much more fantastical, right? It is a place with witches and wizards and warlocks and elves and stuff. Like I wanted to do the reverse of that in my story, to where from David's perspective, the world is a scary place, right? Like there are these Gentile monsters out there and they are ugly and scaly and gross. And then like seers and prophets have always been described like wizards who just like perform magic and incantations and stuff like that. And a reason I wanted to do that is because as David goes out and begins to talk with the people and meet them, he begins to like develop a love for people. And he gets a better understanding of like the humanity of the world. And he begins to question some of these things and wonder if they're true. And one thing that I'm wanting to do with that is it's again, I'm trying to set in motion like all these things that would set David apart. And I want him to go out and I want him to realize that like the Gentiles, they're not monsters. They're different and they're pagans and they don't worship God and they're sinful, but rather than villainizing them, he loves them, right? I want David to love his enemies. And even whenever he goes against Goliath at the end of the story, I don't want it to be because he hates Goliath. I want it to be because he hates what Goliath is doing, right? He does not like how Goliath is defying the God of Israel, but he has nothing against the Gentiles, right? So I want it to be, in many ways, a reverse fantasy story, where from David's perspective, the world is filled with monsters and evil people. But as the story progresses, David realizes, well, no, it's not filled with monsters and evil people. It is evil people. It is filled with evil people, but these are evil people who these are evil people who he wants to give mercy and grace and guide them into righteousness, right? And in many ways, I want David to be somebody who he's not prejudiced where he just cares about the Israelite people. No, he wants Israel to be a light in the midst of the darkness. He wants to be part of the solution, right? And this is just where I'm trying to highlight that David just inherently, just from observing creation, he has a better understanding of the heart of God than a lot of the Israelite people do, right? To where they're simply focused on themselves being better than everybody else. Where David's like, I don't think so, right? We are privileged because God has chosen us, but we're called to go and shine a light to all of them. And from David's perspective, this is like the idea behind my story, is that even though there aren't monsters and ogres and stuff like out there, the world we live in is actually more fantastical than actual fantasy worlds. Because the humans within it, while we look the same, more or less, we're all uniquely made in the eyes of God. We're fearfully and wonderfully made, right? Where God has made us in his image. And through getting to know even the Gentiles and even the pagans, you can learn something about the character of God. And that's one thing that I want to be essential to David's character. And it's going to make him into a better king in the long run, right? I want David to be somebody who is very set apart in that way, to where he's willing to think differently than the rest of the people. One day, Jabez comes to call for David again, and he seems very shaken up, and I put sacred, I meant to say scared. He seems very scared. And this time, it is not Samuel who is seeking David, it's Saul. And David has been summoned to Saul's court for some reason. They do not know why. And David's family is a nervous wreck. Is this a trap? They fear that Saul maybe heard about Samuel's visit, and maybe that they're like, I don't know, maybe he's wanting to like kill David. Their reactions would be very similar to how it happened in the show. But David, he shrugs it off. Either way, he must respond in obedience to the king's command, right? David does not know what's going on, but he does not seem worried about his own safety because he has a promise from God that he will be king. The rest of them are nervous because they're like, oh no, David, you're going to die. He's like, what can man do to me? Right? God has made me a promise, right? He has anointed my head with oil. My cup overflows, right? He's like, I'm good. Like, he's like, he's standing firm on the promises of God. So he's literally he's not anxious at all. He's like, okay, I don't know what's going on, but like, I'll go. Because he's going to walk in obedience to the king, and he is willing to walk into the shadow of death and fear no evil because God is with him. They encourage David to wait and think things through, but he says no. The king has ordered it, and he will obey and trust God to provide. I want you to think of Genesis 24 with Abraham's servant, right? Whenever Abraham's servant goes and gets Rebekah, and they say, oh, just wait for the day. And he says, no, I need to leave now. David, he wants to obey immediately. He says, okay, if the king wants me, I'll go, and I'll go alone. And so before he leaves, he has a heart-to-heart with Jabez, who assures David that he will join David in Gilgal soon, once he's old enough to join the army in just a few short weeks. And so Jabez eventually is going to join the army, and so basically he says, I'll be there soon, dude. I'll be there to take care of you. In my story, I do not have Saul stationed at the fortress in Gibeah. I have him stationed at the fortress in Gilgal. That doesn't seem like a huge difference, but Gibeah is the hometown of Saul, and he did stay there quite a bit in Scripture. But in my story, I wanted it to be at a more spiritually significant place, and Gilgal is... don't worry, Gibeah is going to be in the story very soon. But Gilgal just has like an elevated place in like Scripture, and therefore I have Saul's headquarters being at Gilgal instead. And so David is going to pass through Gibeah as he goes to Gilgal, which, so David departs by himself in the direction of Gilgal, and that's where he's heading right here. Which leads us to chapter 6, the road to Gilgal. And this is comparable to chapter 6 of Harry Potter, the journey from platform 9 3/4. In that chapter, basically we see that Harry is on a journey to Hogwarts, right? And he basically gets on the train, he goes to Hogwarts, and he meets a friend named Ron. Well, in my version, we're going to have David traveling from his world into the new world, right? He's going from Bethlehem to Gilgal, and instead of meeting a friend named Ron, he's going to meet a friend named John, because I'm not that creative. So there you go. I thought that was kind of fun. I mean, I guess you could change the name later on, but he meets a guy named John. The main goals of this chapter are firstly to get David from Bethlehem to Gilgal, and secondly to provide David with his first taste of the outside world. Also to introduce an important character who's going to play an important and crucial role, not only in this book, but in the next book as well. So what we see here is that David's journey is taking longer than normal. After having to constantly stop and ask for directions, he feels in a way over his head. So he's not anxious about this whole situation, but he's also never explored the outside world. He literally has never left Bethlehem. And so he's on this journey by himself. His dad didn't send anybody with him to take care of him. He's literally just walking there. He's having to stop and ask for directions on how to get to Gilgal. The journey takes a while. And so he's only traveled really a few miles before he ends up deciding to stop for the night. After passing by the pagan city of Jebus, he decides to spend the night in the city of Gibeah. And Jebus, if you know anything about that, that's going to be the future city of Jerusalem. And so I wanted to have David, like literally the first place that he goes by after he leaves Bethlehem is going to be the future capital city that he reigns from. So he goes by Jebus. He's heading northwards. And he passes by that, and he goes and spends the night in the city of Gibeah, which I will remind you is the hometown of King Saul. But more importantly to this story right here, it's a very bad idea for him to stay in Gibeah, right? Gibeah in the house of David is where Saul's fortress is at. But like I said, I changed that for my story. Instead, I actually want this to be an allusion back to Judges chapter 19. If you've read Judges 19, you will know it is one of the most depraved chapters in the entire Bible. It's actually a callback to the Sodom and Gomorrah story, because basically there's this Levite and like a Levite priest and his concubine. They come into the city of Gibeah, and some guys want to do some really bad things to them, right? Let's just say it that way. That's the PG version of it. And in many ways, Gibeah, basically the commentary of the author of Judges, is that Gibeah is basically like the Sodom of Israel, right? Basically, it's just a commentary that Gibeah has, like, Israel has gotten so sinful that there's literally a city within them who is worse than the people of Sodom. Which is crazy because Sodom had no Bible, right? The people of Israel during the time of Judges, they have the entire Torah, but they're still just as bad. And so David, he's going to go into Gibeah, and there's going to be like a PG callback to that, right? Some sketchy things are going to happen, and some bad people are going to start like messing with David. It's not going to be like as severe as Judges 19. I did say that this book was going to be like more like mature than like Harry Potter. I don't want to put David in like that like sketchy of a circumstance right off the bat because it's like really mature. But it would be like a clear allusion to that, right? Where like some bad people are like kind of harassing him and messing with him. And then all of a sudden, just whenever David is about to be overwhelmed by the mob, a hooded figure, think Aragorn from Lord of the Rings, a hooded figure shows up and emerges from the shadows. Demonstrating expert swordsmanship, he fights the combatants away and escorts David to safety, right? This dude, I want him to be like the coolest dude ever, right? David, he can fight, but he's way outnumbered, right? He is freaking out. He's backing away. And even he, like, despite him being faithful to God, he's even beginning to doubt God's promises because he's like, I don't see how I'm going to make it out of this out of here alive. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this dude jumps in and he's like a ninja. He's like epic fight scene. He's like saving the day. Think Eliab in, in the, episode 2 of the House of David. Like, it's just a really cool fight scene, except he's going against like a bunch of people and he is wrecking shop. He basically says, come with me if you want to live. And then they like run off into the distance. And this man, he identifies himself later on in the story, or just I guess even in this chapter as well. He identifies his name as John, right? He's the equivalent of Ron, right, in the story. So he identifies his name as John. He reveals that he is planning on traveling to Gilgal come morning, right? So he was staying in Gibeah for the night. He actually has a house in Gibeah. But he was actually planning on going to Gilgal in the morning, and so he invites David to stay at his home that night, and he will basically keep David safe, and he promises to show him the way come daybreak. And so the journey the next day will be a lot smoother than the journey there, because now David will have a companion, and not only a companion, but a dude who knows how to fight. And so this guy, I want him to be very mysterious, right? He's very friendly, but like he's also very like charismatic. He's just like the definition of like Riz. He's just a cool dude. But I want him to be a little bit mysterious, right? The next day, David and John safely make their way to Gilgal, and along the way, they talk about God, and David even plays him one of his songs. I don't know if this would be just a random song that David writes, or if it'd be one of the Psalms, but just be like their way of bonding as they're traveling on this journey. And to David, John rings with all the characteristics of a good king, right? Like, he's looking at him, and like, once again, he's very Aragorn-like. So he looks at this guy and he's like, wow, he's tall, he's handsome, he's worldly wise, he's got a heart of gold. And David begins to doubt. He's like, why didn't God pick this guy? Like, this guy seems legit. And he begins to almost like wonder, is there something wrong with this guy? Like, is this guy sketchy? Like, he begins to kind of like doubt the guy's motives, because this guy is he's everything that David wants to be and more. And he's like, why would God not pick him? It's kind of strange, right? But John seems very, like I said, he seems very mysterious, but it is evident that he genuinely appreciates David's curiosity and his heart for God. And along the journey, he even says, that's rarer than you'd think, right? You get the idea that this guy has traveled around quite a bit and he's seen a lot of things, and there's not many people like David out there. Whereas David, to this point, he really didn't view himself as that unique, right? He kind of figured that there were probably a lot of people like him out there, but apparently there's not. John and David ultimately depart at the gates of the city. He basically just points David towards the fortress, saying that he has some work to do elsewhere, and they just kind of go their separate ways. And with that, we arrive at part 2 of my story, The Stone Circle. But we are going to save that for another day. That is all I've got for y'all today. Let me know what you thought in the comments down below. This is my first time really just like sharing my version of the story with anybody other than like my wife. And so I would love to hear y'all's thoughts and what y'all think about it. Yeah, or how it compares to the House of David show and stuff like that. I just thought this would be kind of a fun video to do. I'm excited to go further into this later on with y'all. It's kind of a fun little creative outlet for me because I literally have like thousands of books that I want to write in my head. I just don't know if I'll ever have the time to do it. I'll probably have to do it in eternity. But yeah, so thank you so much for watching this video. If you haven't liked the video, be sure to do so. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, be sure to do so. Turn on the notification bell so you know when future videos like this are coming your way. Until next time, my name is David Tate. This is Now Let's Be Honest. Be sure to keep a smile on your face. Don't let anybody steal your joy. And of course, remember who you are.